Hi, I'm David Herriot from endtheunion.scot, the website that tells the real story of how Scotland ended up in the Union, how it ended up in the UK, and more importantly, it will tell you how Scotland can escape the Union without asking. That's the theme of the website. Take, don't ask. Take our independence back. Stop asking. So stop asking for another referendum. And why do we need to ask anyway? I mean, what happened to Scotland? Why on earth are we in a union in the first place? And to answer that question, we need to go back in time a wee bitty, back in fact to the 17th century. Now, we need to remember at this point that both Scotland and England were independent nation states. Scotland, for nearly 1,000 years before, had its own parliament, its own currency, its own trade routes around Europe, had its own parliament that was controlled uniquely in Europe by the people. But in the early years of the 17th century, something happened that would significantly shape Scotland's future. And that significant something was the death of the English Queen, Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth died childless. And in fact, her only heir was our own king, James VI. Now, as soon as Jamie the Sax that we called him, as soon as Jamie heard that he was the new king of England, man, he hightailed it across the border. Whoosh! Big pound signs in his eyes. Never came back. Maybe he came back once, but he didn't really care about us anymore. Because the throne of England was a great gig for Jamie. Gave him lots of dosh. But his leaving left Scotland bereft. And kings in those days, they still had a fair amount of power. And England was starting to build its empire. And shared king or not, we would not be allowed to get in the way. One of the things that England did in the middle of the 17th century, about 1651 or something, it passed something called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts were there to stop countries dealing directly or trading directly with England's colonies. And it affected, of course, Netherlands, Spain, France, Portugal. Oh, and Scotland, even though we shared a king with England, didn't really matter. And that meant that we could not trade directly with, countries like, well, the colonies in the US. So we thought, well, why don't we have our own colony? That'd be a good idea. And it was a good idea. It was called Darien. You've maybe heard of it. And Darien is is in Central America. And the idea was, it was a good idea actually. The idea was to build a colony at Darien. Ships would sail to Darien, unload their goods, transport them across the 30 miles to the Pacific side of Central America, where they'd be loaded again on ships and off to the Far East. And that would save a fortune going right round the bottom of South America, round the treacherous waters of Cape Horn. So it was a good idea. But when England saw this, they thought, no way is that going to happen. And they actively sabotaged Darien. Then the country, England, along with the East India Company that basically controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, had its own army and everything, actively sabotaged Darien. They pressured the investors to withdraw all their money. And then, along with the Royal Navy, they told their colonies that they could not trade with Darien and that they could not offer any assistance at all to the settlers in Darien. Remember, we still had a shared king? You remember this bit? And of course, the Royal Navy blockaded Darien, so we couldn't get any trade anyway. So eventually, Darien collapsed and the settlers limped home. And it's important to say at this point, of course, that Darien, although Darien collapsed, it did not leave Scotland bankrupt, as you'll read in some history books and some blogs. Plenty of people in Scotland, of course, were bankrupt. Everything from aristocrats who lost their shirt on Darien to old Mrs. McGinty around the corner who chucked a few groats into the Darien scheme. But it did not leave Scotland. Bankrupt. But Darien was a lesson for England, and Darien could not be repeated. Scotland could not be in the way of England's warlike empire plans. So a solution needed to be found. War, of course, might be a solution, but wars are costly. So another solution needed to be found, and union was that solution. Union accomplished in the 18th century what Edward Longshanks could not accomplish in the 13th century. Keep Scotland in a constitutional vice under the permanent grip and control of England. And of course, that's what happened. And it turned out, actually, that it wasn't that hard. And to find out what happened, watch the next video. Or look at endtheunion.scot. All right?